Creepypasta time. I should have never taken a back road to get home. I lived in a fairly rural area. I worked an hour away from home. The drive never really bothered me though. It always gave me time to think about my day. In the morning, I had time to think about what I had to do. At night, I had time to unwind from being in work mode. Back then, I had just purchased my first home. I was 29, fresh out of college, and found a great job. Granted, I was in a great deal of debt. I had just graduated medical school with a specialty in infectious disease. None of that mattered though at the time, the debt I mean. I was a young doctor. I was proud, but undeniably naive. Everything seemed perfect. It was perfect. The hour each way to work was a small price to pay for what I had accomplished. There was hospital that was more local, but it wasn't the kind of hospital that you'd willingly go to. Also, they didn't have a department for my specialty. It was a fairly easy route. I got on the highway and it was basically a straight shot. By the end of my first week, I had the route completely memorized. For the first year, I was confident and full of pride. Things were good. Things were normal. About a year and some change into my new life, I noticed one morning on my way to work that the state was repaving the highway. They were only working on the oncoming side, the way I took on my way home. Irritated, I looked up alternative routes on how to get home on my lunch break. There weren't many, and the ones there were seemed to add on an extra 45 minutes. 1 hour to get home was one thing. 2 hours to get home was ridiculous. I thought they usually gave people a warning before they started construction. I remember thinking to myself that it was whatever, and I just used the GPS on my phone. It was around 9 at night when I left the hospital. I settled into my car, put my phone onto the bolted stand on the dashboard, and typed in my address. It automatically gave me a different route to take, already taking the roadwork into account. I clicked start, and off I went. The beginning of the route took me through a little town and a couple of well-off neighborhoods. Seemed nice enough. I hadn't known it even existed. It wasn't on the map I was looking at when I was at work. Maybe it was just too small? At least that's what I told myself. Around a half hour into the route, it started to become more rural, and narrow. I loved a scenic view, hence why I moved to rural place. It was way too dark to appreciate the scenery though. The road narrowed so tight, it felt like a one-way. If another car were to come speeding in the opposite direction, we'd collide indefinitely. I went slow, kept my brights on, and stayed as straight as I could. Every 10 minutes, it felt like I was seeing the same thing. I felt like I was going in circles. It was so dark. No street lights or houses. Only trees leading into a cliff with a dainty guardrail as protection. The other side went uphill and led into extremely dense forest. That side didn't have a guardrail. I was laser focused on getting home. I didn't care how long it took me. Upon coming around a fairly sharp bend, I saw something scatter in my peripheral vision. When I fully made the bend, I slowed down. I couldn't really see anything, so if an animal was in the road, I was easily going to hit it. I drove for about 5 minutes before I saw a figure in the distance. I couldn't quite make out if it was a man or a woman, but I could tell they had their thumb out. They were hitchhiking? Here? I hadn't seen a single car the entire time. When I started to get closer, I could tell it was a woman. She was young. She seemed maybe in her early 20s. Her head was down and her long blonde hair covered her face. She seemed lost. I know you should never really stop for a hitchhiker, for safety reasons, but this was just too weird. If she needed help, who knows when the next car would go by. My doctor senses kicked in. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Hello? Miss? Are you in need of medical attention? I'm a doctor." My voice came out more concerning than I expected. "No. Thank you for stopping." Her voice was quiet. I could barely hear her. "Yeah, no problem. Do you?" I stuttered. "Do you need help getting somewhere?" Before I could even finish talking, she fled. She descended into the woods so fast. It was like she vanished right in front of my eyes. The forest was so dense and dark. All it took was a quick sprint and she was completely out of my range of vision. Now, I tried to call the police. There was zero service, as you could imagine. I decided I would call them when I got home. I wasn't stopping again, and I was freaked the hell out. I did manage to make it home, 3 hours after I initially left. I tried to look up how long the road work would take, but I couldn't find anything online. Peeved, I emailed one of my co-workers if they could fill in for me for next 3 days. I hadn't taken a day off since I started working there, and he was happy to oblige. I figured the road work would have been done by then, and I could actually have a few days to myself. After that, I made myself something quick to eat, got in the shower, and went to bed. I had completely forgotten about my encounter with the woman. I was exhausted. I fell asleep thinking about all of the free time I was about to have. I was pretty excited. Around 2:15 a.m., I was awoken by a scratching sound. It sounded like mice crawling all throughout the walls. The sound was sharp and deep. At first I thought I was still sleeping and it was just a dream. Then I heard a crash from the kitchen. I sat up immediately. When I bought my home, I also purchased a gun for protection. I never actually planned on using it and knew the bare minimum about owning a firearm. I only got it because I was going to be living alone. It made me feel safe. I kept it in a box underneath my bed. Well, this was the first time I had felt extremely uneasy. I quietly got out of bed and pulled the box out from underneath. I tried to load the gun as quickly and quietly as I could. Once it was done, I listened. No footsteps. No banging or crashing. Just silence. I made my way down the hall. My steps went down in circular motion. It wasn't quite a spiral, and it had a landing in the middle. Directly down my stairs, my kitchen was in direct front view. I had my phone's flashlight pointing with one hand, and the weapon in the other. Walking down the stairs felt dreadful. Like walking down to get reprimanded by your parents, but more sinister. I walked down slow, trying not to make any noise. When I got to the landing, I spun around and pointed my flashlight towards the kitchen. I couldn't see anything, so I went the whole way down. Upon walking into my kitchen, nothing seemed out of place. I walked around the island that sat in the middle of the kitchen and stepped on something sharp. I shined my flashlight toward the ground. It was one of my grandmother's antique ceramic plates. I kept them locked in a glass cabinet, and I never took them out. They were more for show than actual use. I flipped on the light switch. Tears filled my eyes as I made my way to the closet that I kept the broom in. Upon walking up to the closet, something else caught my attention. My front porch light was on. Which wouldn't have been weird if it wasn't motion activated. Someone or something would have had to physically come onto my porch to trigger the light. I checked my door. It was still locked. I looked out of my window for a few minutes, continuously looking behind me. After I felt like no one was outside, I grabbed the broom and flicked on every light on my way back to the kitchen. I swept up the broken pieces and threw them away. I put the broom back, checked the rest of the house, and ended up sleeping on the couch with my gun on the coffee table. The next day went completely normal. I actually had time to paint, which I never got to do anymore. I caught up on some reading, did some cleaning, and basically just lounged around. It wasn't until after dinner I remembered the weird night I had previously. It had completely slipped my mind, even though the gun was still in plain view. I hadn't even thought of how the plate got out of a locked cabinet, or why my porch light was on. It all came rushing back, along with the memory of the woman on the side of the road. I realized I had never called the police. I really had meant to. The memory of my weird night became drowned out by the thought of that woman. I wondered if she was okay. I remember thinking how I should have called the police. If something happened to her, I'd feel partially responsible. I decided it would be best to just let it go, as I didn't want to deal with the police. I figured they would think I imagined it from working such long hours. That night, I went to bed like any other night. This time I was awoken by a slight cry. In my half-asleep state, it almost sounded like distant sobbing. It got louder, and I was fully awoken when it turned into a scream. I sat up and looked at my phone. 2:15 a.m. Weird. I thought to myself but said audibly. I know I heard a scream, and I thought I heard crying? The air felt still. It was so quiet you could hear a needle drop. Then I heard it. I heard crying. Like that of a grieving widow, or the mourning of a loss of a child. It was a soft, but gut-wrenching cry. It sounded like it was coming from either within the house, or right outside. I went to grab the box under my bed before I remembered I left the gun out. It was still on the table. Oh no. No 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 no. I whispered. I sat on the floor and racked my brain on the next logical move. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. This time, I was much quieter and moved methodically. The crying became clearer as I moved towards the steps. It sounded like it was coming from the front of the house. I finally made it to the living room and grabbed the gun off of the coffee table. Now feeling much more confident, I made my way to front door. I could see the porch light shining through the curtains. The crying was loud. I checked the door. It was still locked. Finally, I moved my curtains. It was the girl from the road. Her clothes were the same, but much more tattered. Her eyes were completely bloodshot. Tears were flowing from her eyes. A small stream of blood flowed from the side of her head. Her blonde hair was partly matted and bloodied. She was smiling, but it didn't match the emotion in her eyes. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't even making any sort of motion, but she was crying. It was ear-piercing. She was crying, but she stood as still as a mannequin. She was so close to the window, her breath was creating condensation on the glass. I just stood there, staring at her. She lifted up a tape recorder and clicked a button. It let out an ear-piercing cry. It was pre-recorded. Horror washed over my body as I watched the tears continue to flow her eyes as I heard the recorded cry. What the hell? I mumbled under my breath. I kept eye contact as I reached for my doorknob. As soon as I looked away to make sure the door was still locked, she fled. I watched her run down my front porch steps and into the woods that surrounded the right side of my house. I watched out of my window for maybe another hour until I felt safe again. I returned to the living room and sat on the couch. Replaying everything that just happened over in my head, I felt a shiver go down my spine. I knew her. Before I saw her on the road, before that night. I just couldn't remember where. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I called the police around 7 in the morning. I told them what had happened, and surprisingly they believed me. I wasn't sure why they were being so understanding. They told me to keep my doors locked and they'd give me a call later that day. While I waited for their call, I couldn't get her face out of my brain. That's when it dawned on me. There was a lady who escaped the psychiatric unit of the hospital I worked at. I had come into contact with her multiple times, as she had contracted an infection during an unfortunate miscarriage. The loss of her baby is what led her to be committed to the psychiatric unit. I called the hospital and asked for her name. My coworker seemed confused. Hey, are you okay? I heard the police came by your house this morning. They're out looking for her now. You're not hurt, are you? My coworker sounded worried. Yeah, I'm fine. I think I saw her last night. Weird things have been going on. I don't know what to make of it. I think she's been in my house, but I can't be sure. Why do you sound so panicked? I tried to remain my composure. They found a note on her bed. Man. She thinks you're responsible for the loss of her baby. I thought that's why you took those days off, to stay safe until they found her? His voice now more confused than worried. No. I didn't know. No one told me? That doesn't even make any sense. I only treated her infection? I probably sounded frantic at this point. No one told you this? Even the police knew. You need to go stay with your parents or something. Especially if she's been at your house. I'll cover you, just stay safe. I got to go. Call me soon. His voice was stern. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. My voice was faint. I hung up the phone. I packed all of my things and went to load everything into my car. I called the police and told them I'd be leaving until she was caught. They recommended that was the safest course of action. I ended up selling the house and quitting my job. I relocated closer to my parents and found a job at the local hospital there. The police did finally catch her though. The last phone call I received about the situation was from the police. They found her inside of my house, inside of the attic. She had scratched profanity into the floorboards and was found with a gun. My gun. She had replaced my gun with a fake. The bullets were fake too. She found my house key under the front doormat. She supposedly found my house following the wooded area, and once she saw my car, she knew she was headed the right direction. They say if I would have stayed one more day, I probably wouldn't have made it. It's been years, and I still can't bring myself to have another 3-day weekend.